Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my Worlds 2023 Top 20 Players Ranking List, whatever you want to call it. Incredibly excited to do this video. This is always one of the more controversial ones that I'm going to be doing all year long. Obviously, ranking teams can also be relatively controversial, but for the most part, teams are a little bit easier to establish. Players, you're going to have a much wider range of opinions on, especially when it comes down to trying to isolate their performances as opposed to what they're able to offer their team. And so top 20 players becomes significantly more difficult. I'm still incredibly excited to do this. I'm incredibly excited to get into this list. It's more of like the top 27 players, and we'll kind of talk about that in a second because there are quite a few honorable mentions. But if you are excited for this video, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, I don't usually ask for this at the beginning of videos because it kind of feels like pandering, but we're putting a lot of time and effort into this pre-Worlds coverage. Of course, we're going to be covering every single day of the tournament as well. If you are enjoying these videos, please go ahead and leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know that you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. So if you are, excited for this video and excited for these opinions, I would really appreciate it if you slammed a like on this video. But without further ado, let's just jump right into the content of the video itself. Of course, I'm going to be going over my top 20 players at the tournament. I'll be going into relative depth on each of them, kind of talking about what kind of year they had and what I'm projecting for them at Worlds this year, the kind of play style and player that they'll end up being. Of course, we do have a couple of honorable mentions, and I'm excited to go over them, and they're going to be up on the screen now. It's going to be 7 honorable mentions. I did 7 last year, and it felt wrong to do less this year because I honestly think that it's a deeper player pool than it was at Worlds last year. I think that there are a ridiculous amount of good players at the tournament this year, and honestly, it was hard to break this down to just the top 20. I did end up getting there, but as you can see, there are some really, elite level players in my honorable mentions, and unfortunately, they just weren't able to crack the top 20 in my opinion. So without further ado, let's kind of go over why some of these guys are honorable mentions, starting from left to right, which means we get to start with our one North American representative in this video, Berserker from Cloud9. I truly do believe he's pretty easily the best choice to, be the best North American player at the tournament. Not only is he, so much better than everybody else he's playing against in the LCS at the current moment, but I really do believe that he's probably number 21 on this list for me. And I know that might surprise a lot of people. A lot of people aren't going to look at a player from the LCS and rank them that highly, but Berserker really is built different. Not only has he completely destroyed that league over the past year especially, but, if the rumors are to be believed, he's getting a lot of interest from top LCK teams moving into 2024, and I really wouldn't be surprised if next year we're talking about Berserker as a top 10, top 5 player in the world if he gets on a team that can maybe do a little bit more with the pressure that he's able to generate. Maybe a team that, no offense to Cloud9, they're a very good team. We'll talk about them in the primer, but they're not going to be able to make the most of Berserker like a T1 or, like a Damwon would be able to do. And so I think Berserker, from an individual perspective, absolutely deserves to be there. Really, really no question for me. And then, unfortunately, the one European player on this list, I wish I could include more, is going to be Mickey X. He was pretty clearly the best player in Europe over the course of this year. I do truly believe that, and it's crazy to see the bounce back that he had. This was a player that I was actually very low on at the end of last year. I thought his time on Excel was very bad, but he's completely turned it around for G2. He's been the driving force. This team has played around him super consistently. He's the best player coming out of Europe. I think you could realistically put someone like Caps in this conversation as well, perhaps Hansama, but I think Mickey was the pretty clear choice to be the honorable mention out of the LEC, and I wish I could give more honorable mentions to the Western players, but you've got so many good Eastern players that they kind of just end up dominating the list. Spoiler alert, everyone in my top 20 is either from the LCK or the LPL. Other honorable mentions, I've got 3 from the LCK here. Keria from T1. Kind of crazy that Keria is not making the top 20, but he did have a little bit of a down year, especially when you consider how he played when Faker was not in the lineup. T1 in general just struggled so much without Faker, and Keria certainly was a part of that. He had more good games than I think people give him credit for, which is why he's on this honorable mentions list, but it certainly wasn't the same kind of dominating year or I guess summer split that we were kind of hoping for after he was the unanimous MVP in the spring split. He looked like the single best player in the world. He would have been number 1 on these rankings going into MSI, but alas, things end up changing, and he ends up not making the top 20 here. Deft gets in my honorable mention. Pretty crazy that he's an honorable mention this year, and he wasn't last year. He wasn't even in my honorable mentions, let alone my list last year when he won the world title on DRX. It's pretty crazy how things changed, but I think individually he's performed a lot better this year. He's been given a lot more responsibility on this DK team to actually win early and try to, generate great leads for the mid game that he really wasn't given on DRX. That team really wanted to play around jungle mid, Pioshik and Zeka, and he just didn't have the opportunity to shine nearly as much. I think that's kind of been the opposite here on DK. He's been incredibly consistent and more than worthy of this honorable mention slot. Dorian, for the second year in a row, is going to be an honorable mention on this list. I think he had a much better year this year than he did last year. Last year, I felt like I was compromising by putting him on the honorable mentions because I didn't want to put him on the list at all. You can go back and watch that video to hear me talk about it, but this year, I feel really bad not putting him in the top 20 because I think he's a top, 3 to 5 top laner in the world. It's just there aren't really a lot of top laners that can change the game as much as a lot of other positions, and so he ends up ranking a little bit lower than maybe you would want in a position like this, but I really do believe that Dorian had a career year and a breakout year, and he's a big reason why Gen G was so strong this year, so definitely at the very least deserving of an honorable mention. And then 2 LPL players, Light coming in from Weibo Gaming. Light's really good. The bot lane for Weibo is really strong. We'll talk about that a bit later, but Light's really, really good, and I think he's just very consistent. I don't know if I'm as high on him this year as I would have been last year had he made the World Championships. He was carrying that LNG team for a lot of 2022, but his 2023 was a little bit more up and down. Still a lot of up, more up than down for sure, and he is probably the biggest carry reason why Weibo is at this tournament, in my opinion, but just not enough to be able to crack that top 20. And then one of the biggest fallers, at least that's still at the tournament this year, and that's going to be Yagao as an honorable mention here for Billy Gaming. He was in my top 10. I believe he was number 9 last year in my rankings for JDG. He didn't quite have the same kind of dominant year that he had for JDG, in my opinion, but especially if you're looking at his spring split, he was phenomenal. BLG definitely struggled a little bit more as they went through the playoff bracket, but Yagao is fantastic, and we're going to be seeing more of Billy as we go throughout this list. Yagao just barely missing out, one of the players that I feel the worst about not including. And so those are my 7 honorable mentions, but I think basically any of them have a case to be made to get onto this list. Of course, there are a lot of open slots. Like I said, it's very volatile how you can rank these players because of just the varying opinions, but now that we've got our, 27 to 21 out of the way, it's time to jump into the official top 20. And kicking off our top 20 list, it's going to be a player that, I don't know, I think people might be a little bit surprised to see him in the top 20. Some people might be surprised to see him so low if you haven't been following the LCK, but as people who follow my channel know, I'm a little bit higher on this player than maybe consensus is at the current moment. Coming in at number 20 for me, the start of the list, it is going to be ShowMaker, the mid laner for D plus Kia. He is just barely going to make the top 20. Again, like I said, it's a very competitive top 20. There are so many dominant players in the world at the current moment. ShowMaker, though, is definitely one of them. Now, like I said, there are going to be varying opinions on this placement because I think some people are going to see this as too low because it's ShowMaker and he consistently overperforms at international tournaments. He steps up when it matters the most, and he was really good in that series to qualify for Worlds in the first place against Hanwha Life. Has been really good in the, important series, I would say, for DK in general, but there's also that big contingent that's going to look at DK and say, well, ShowMaker's had a lot of bad games over the course of this year, and that's absolutely true. ShowMaker has had a couple of really bad games. I just think it honestly gets a little bit undersold how good his good games were over the course of this year. There were multiple stretches, like I talked about in my LCK weekly reviews, where, if you're talking about a 2 or a 3 week stretch, like ShowMaker was the best player in the world for a couple of those 2-3 week stretches. It wasn't consistent at all, and that's why he ranked so low on this list. If he had performed like he did at the beginning of the spring split, or I'm sorry, at the beginning of the summer split, or at the end of the spring split, over the course of the entire year, then he probably would be in the top 5. He really was that good during that stretch of time. He just wasn't able to consistently be able to do it. However, he's still a massive asset to the DK team. In my opinion, he's the best player on the team at the current moment, or the one that is performing the best at the current moment. And I think that, as long as you have ShowMaker at a tournament like this, you're probably going to be feeling relatively good. Now, LeBlanc did get nerfed. That's obviously big for ShowMaker, but we do know that his champion pool is really wide. Like, he's going to be able to play basically anything that you want. Wasn't able to make an all-pro team for me this year because, again, LCK mid laners are just absolutely cracked. It's so stacked to try and break through there, as we're going to see going throughout this list, but ShowMaker more than deserving, in my opinion, of a spot in the top 20. And then moving on to number 19 in the rankings, and I don't really know where to put this player, so he kind of ends up near the bottom of this list, but he could go a lot higher. Number 19 is going to be Gumayusi, the AD carry for T1. Certainly an intriguing year for Guma. I think overall, when you're looking at T1 season, you're certainly not pinning a lot of the blame on Guma. He was the kind of forgotten member in the spring split when everything was just going right, when every single member of T1 was first team All-Pro. People were talking about, yeah, you know, every member should be first team All-Pro, maybe except Gumayusi, because he hasn't been quite as much of a standout. But then you look at the summer split, and things are going really well. They start to play through him a bit more, they give him a few more resources, and then Faker leaves, and obviously everything starts to destroy the team. Faker taking that break really kind of destroyed T1's momentum just in general, but Guma was the one player on the team that I think mostly survived that, and was really basically the same player. He just didn't have the same kind of help around him that maybe some of the other, you know, AD carries in the league did, and so I do have quite a bit of faith in Gumayusi. Now, remember last year at this tournament, I was kind of pounding the table for Guma. A lot of people were super down on him. They were saying that he was super overrated, that he was the worst player on T1, he was going to hold them back. I was pushing back on that narrative a ridiculous amount, and that proved to be correct. He was one of the best players in their finals run last year at the World Championship. I still think he's going to be a massive positive for this team, and with the way that T1 was playing in the playoffs, I do believe that he is, you know, going to be fine, and this, you know, ranking might even be a little bit too low by the time we hit the end of the tournament, but I think when you're looking at the grand scheme of how things have gone over the course of 2023, Gumayusi coming in at number 19, I feel like is a pretty fair assessment. And then moving on to number 18 in the list, and I don't know if this one's going to be controversial. I don't know where people stand on this player. I think he's incredibly undervalued in terms of how much people talk about him, but coming in at number 18, it is going to be Crisp, the support for Weibo Gaming. Really love what he's been able to do all year long. Crisp has been a very good player for a very long time, and I think a lot of people know of him and know how good he is from his past accomplishments. Obviously, from his time on FPX, he's a former world champion. He's been at the top of the LPL for a considerable amount of time. However, I think you can make an argument that this is one of his more individually impressive years that he's ever had in his entire career. The fact that he's making the top 20 list at Worlds is a huge accomplishment. For supports, it's quite difficult to be able to kind of shine enough to be able to make this list, specifically in the LPL, where, you know, there are just a lot of flashy players in a lot of other roles, but I think Crisp's hyper consistency over the course of this year is what really allowed me to feel comfortable in putting him this high on the list above players like ShowMaker and Gumayusi that have been very good for long periods of time. I know what Crisp is, and I know that he's going to be a major positive for Weibo. This is a little bit of a spoiler for the rest of the list, but he is the highest and the only ranked Weibo gaming player in the top 20, and I really do believe he's the best player on that team. I think he's been the driving force for how they wanted to play the game, whether that's through him and through bot lane, you know, oftentimes trying to play for light in the late game, as I talked about in my honorable mention segment, or if they want to get Crisp on the move and moving around the map, trying to help Xiaohu, you know, other players. Crisp is just really, really good at League of Legends. He's good at every facet of the game. He's not really this player that's really going to be locked into a box. He can do basically a little bit of everything that you're going to need him to do. You can see that from the Rakan, the Nami, the Leona. Engagers are obviously what Crisp is most well known for from his time on FPX, because that was the meta when that team was incredibly good, but this team played more Lucian Nami than anybody else in the LPL in 2023. They are more willing to go for these aggressive early game lanes as well. Crisp likes to be a playmaker. He likes to be involved in skirmishes and action as is appropriate for LPL supports, and I think all of that kind of coupled together with the fact that he's a really smart player and where he needs to be makes it a pretty easy choice, in my opinion, to include him in this top 20. And then going to number 17, this is a little bit of a drop-off from last year for this player, which is pretty unfortunate, because I think that, honestly, I view them pretty much the exact same as I did in 2022. I just think that maybe the talent, you know, at the tournament has gotten a little bit better, as I've said throughout this, up until this point. Coming in at number 17 for me, it is going to be 369, the top laner for JD Gaming. Now, this could seem criminally low to some people, but again, you know, cut me some slack. Look at the players that are going to be listed above him. They're all incredibly dominant, carry-oriented players, and while 369 can do that, he's really not going to be asked to do that. And so if I have a tiebreaker between players that I think are of relatively similar skill, and one of them is going to carry and the other is probably going to play weak side the whole tournament, I'm gonna rank the weak side player a little bit lower. And I know 369 is incredibly valuable. I'm certainly not trying to take that away. He was an all-pro caliber player in the LPL this year. I didn't quite give him an all-pro nod because I think that there were a couple of really good top laners in the LPL in particular. You know, most of them not making the tournament because that's just how top lane goes. But 369 is just very stable and very solid. I think a lot of people look at him as this really premier weak side top laner, but he can be a big carry player. That's what he was known for before he started joining a lot of these super teams. And so I still do trust 369 a considerable amount in basically whatever circumstance he's going to be in. He's a top 20 player for a reason. If he was just this, you know, weak side top laner that was around a lot of good players, he wouldn't be on this list. You're not forced to be on this list just because you're on one of the best teams in the world. You do need to be able to prove it, but I do think that his output at the World Championships and his output over the course of this year is just a little bit lower than what you're going to be getting out of some of the players that are listed, you know, a couple of spots above him. And so, you know, it's an interesting dichotomy to make. I think 369 is interesting in terms of the current meta, and in terms of how things are playing out. Obviously, everybody plays Renekton. I'm not afraid of 369 being able to play Renekton, but does prefer the tanks, and that's what JDG likes to go towards. I mean, obviously, the Cassante is huge, and, you know, Cassante is still really good before the rework. It's still going to be just as strong as it has been. Ornn, Gragas, you know, I got some comments about Gragas potentially rising in popularity due to the Renekton magic resist nerfs, and, you know, Gragas just generally being really consistent. 369 is a really good Gragas player. That's obviously what he's most known for. Could be something that we could see brought out by him over the course of this tournament, but in general, he's going to do exactly what we think he's going to do. He's going to be an incredibly consistent weak side player that, if he is given a couple of ganks here or there, can be a very great team fighter, one of the best in the entire world. Very, very consistent, but maybe lacks the upside to push him inside that top 15 for me. And then our final player before the top 15 does officially kick off. Coming in at number 16 is a player that, man, I'm happy to see on this list. I'm happy to see them have such a breakout year. It is going to be Elk, the AD carry for Billy Gaming, coming in at number 16. Great, great, great player. I mean, I've been praising Elk for many years now. People who have followed the channel have known that I've been on the Elk bandwagon for a very long time. The WE days were fantastic. They were a lot better than people were giving him credit for. His mechanical prowess really shone through during that time period, and I really do believe that, you know, he showed glimpses of being one of the better AD carries in the world on WE. Got stuck on an Ultra Prime team that just wasn't able to play around him last year. Basically the worst situation possible for an AD carry. He was carrying the hell out of that team in Spring Split, as I went over a lot on this channel, and then kind of gave up in summer. I don't blame him. The rest of that team was an absolute disaster, but Ultra Prime ended up being a wash, goes over to Billy, and reemerges as, you know, the best he's ever been. You know, one of the top 3 to 5 AD carries in the entire world, and somebody you really have to watch out for basically in any game. He can absolutely hyper carry. He's crazy aggressive, not afraid to make a ton of plays. This is the exact type of AD carry you want if you want to try to win the World Championships. Now, has Elk proven that he's going to be able to consistently perform like that on the highest level? No, he's never been to the World Championships before. This is his first one ever, and so you gotta give at least a little bit of room for variance in terms of a tournament like this, just because there are so many players that have proven it at this world stage before. But he was sensational at MSI, basically everything you could have asked for, his first ever international tournament, and he's been really good over the course of basically the entire LPL year. Now, this is something I'm probably going to say about a lot of the Billy players, but their playoff run really did worry me at least a little bit. A lot of the expectations for this team were to be a guaranteed top 2 team in the world, or, you know, top 3 at the very worst team in the world, and they weren't able to get that done. They end up not even getting second place. They don't even make finals in the LPL. They end up dropping to LNG. In third place, they auto-qualify because of championship points, but it is at least a concern that this team did look rather tepid against that LNG team. They got absolutely destroyed by JD Gaming, and Elk in particular did not look great in either of those series. But I am going to hold out and say, you know, the fact that they dominated the regular season, that they were so good at MSI, that, you know, they had made finals pretty surprisingly in the Spring Split, is enough evidence to show me that this team still is incredibly good, and that Elk, especially as a player, deserves to be graded very, very highly. I think a lot of people were kind of surprised by the breakout that he had as a player, but again, the more you follow the LPL, the more you followed Elk over the course of his career, this isn't the most surprising breakout of all time. I'm really interested to see what he's going to be able to do with the opportunity to finally play on the world stage. Hopefully he can make the most of it. And then coming in at number 15, it's a very, very talented player in a very weird circumstance. This is one of only 2 players on the list to stay in the exact same spot that they were in on my list last year. It's a very weird number to be able to completely sit at, but coming in again at number 15 for me for the second year in a row, it is going to be GALA, the AD carry for this time LNG Esports. Really, really good stuff from GALA over the course of this year. Has basically proven everything that we could want out of him as a player. I think we were talking about whether or not he was going to be as dominant after he left RNG. Obviously, the team that really, I don't want to say resurrected his career because it wasn't dead in the water or anything, but he was a pretty low-level prospect until he went to RNG and then just became one of the best AD carries in the entire world. Could he do that outside of the structure of a system that has continuously produced a ridiculous amount of good talent? Well, the answer to that question was a resounding yes in 2023, or at least in the summer split. Even going back to spring when he was on RNG, that team was an absolute disaster. Absolutely no one could play. There were a complete lack of breakout players on the team. Tong Yuan, Angel in the mid lane, whoever was playing was a disaster for that team. The mid lane position was the biggest hole in the entire league. Ming looked a lot worse coming back, midway through the split. Topside never really looked all that good in the spring split, but GALA looked fantastic. He was kind of carrying them, and he did carry them into the playoffs, and then obviously goes over to LNG in the summer split, kind of creating this big 3 on LNG with Tarzan and Scout, and he delivered for the most part. He was everything that I think LNG could have wanted from him. He was a really good early game player, someone who was pretty consistent over the back half of games as well, just a very complete AD carry. GALA is somebody who I've tagged with kind of the reputation of being the most fairly rated player in the entire world, because I see a lot of people talking very highly about GALA, but nobody really includes him in like the best in the world conversations, and I think that's basically exactly where he should be. He's a top 15-ish player in the world, somebody who you're going to be incredibly happy about having on your team. You're going to feel incredibly good about being able to play him, and he's going to be able to help carry you into a potential world championship. He's certainly good enough for that, but he's not really someone that I'm going to sit there and say, like, is going to change every single game that he's a part of. I think that his consistency is a positive. It can be a little bit of a negative as well, because honestly, the dominant breakout performances that some of the other AD carries have, even someone like Elk that we talked about, or a lot of the other AD carries that we're going to talk about a little bit higher on this list, GALA just doesn't have performances like that nearly as often. Now, that's not to say he can't have them. He's still an AD carry, and he's still one of the best and most mechanically talented in the world, but GALA's strength is his consistency, is his game-to-game positivity. He really doesn't let you down, hardly ever, and you can see that in the 5 Player of the Series awards that he got. It's very common for him to be the best player on his team because he's the one that is really capitalizing on a lot of the other things that are going on, I guess you could say. So GALA, number 15, feels like an appropriate place to put him. I think some people are going to want to see him higher, but LNG is one of those teams that, while they did finish incredibly strong, did still have their problems over the course of the summer split, and I'm not willing to throw out the entirety of that split for tape in order to just kind of say they're better. But GALA versus Elk is certainly an interesting conversation to have. I have GALA coming out just barely on top and at the start of my top 15 here. And then moving on to number 14 now, I think we're really firmly in the territory of very great players. Players that are actively going to make your team a lot better, are very big positives towards your team, but still do have, some deficiencies that maybe the best players in the world just don't have. And coming in at number 14 for me, it is going to be BDD, the mid laner for KT Rolster. What a year for BDD, considering what happened in 2022. 2022 is just about as bad of a year as could possibly happen for BDD as a player. Was playing for that Nongshim Red Force team that was just a complete disaster, basically from moment one. Ended up getting COVID pretty early on in the year and just seemed to never really figure it out after that. I'm not sure if it's because of, the illness or not really being able to recover, or if it had more to do with just the fact that a lot of those players, I think, gave up on the season as it went further and further. But the expectations were very much up and down for what BDD was going to be able to offer in 2023, coming off of the worst year of his entire career. But he's answered all of those expectations just about as well as anybody could have ever hoped. What a dominant year from BDD, and for KT Rolster in general. This was one of the best teams in the entire league, in the entire world, going into the playoffs. They weren't able to get the job done as the number 1 seed, but they still did look just about as good as I expected them to. They actually went and did exactly what I expected them to do, which is come into Worlds as the number 3 seed from the LCK, and so I'm not really shocked by their performance there, but BDD, I think, was a big part of what they wanted to do this year. I do think his spring was a little bit more standoutish than his summer from an individual perspective. I know KT in general looked a lot better in summer, or at the very least looked a lot more consistent as we got into that summer split, but I think a lot of the spotlight ended up going in a few different places, most notably top and bot lane, and BDD didn't get nearly as much of a shine, I would say, in the summer split. But thinking back to spring, he was an MVP finalist for me in the LCK, somebody who I really do think, showed that he can be one of the best mid laners in the entire world. Now, stylistically, he doesn't necessarily play champions that are going to stand out as kind of carry-oriented play around me type of picks. The Azir definitely is, a little bit of that, but Annie, Vigar, a lot of these more setup burst mages that are going to be there to more so support the rest of the team, and I think that's why a lot of his standout plays ended up falling off a bit more as we moved into the summer split, but I still like BDD a lot. Number 14 still feels relatively right for him, coming in just above players like GALA and Elk. I think is going to surprise some people, maybe because he doesn't have the same kind of dominant games that they have, but in terms of consistency, I would argue that I would take BDD over either of those two, and that's pretty crazy to say. I really like him as a player, and he's going to help KT grow a lot as a team, and he's a big reason why they're here in the first place. And then moving on to number 13, we've got some back-to-back LCK mid laners, if you will, and certainly an intriguing back-to-back considering how I've kind of compared these two all year long. Coming in just above BDD at number 13, it is going to be Faker, the mid laner for T1. He is going to be coming in as the highest ranked T1 player, and right above a player in BDD that I think a lot of people are kind of looking at as kind of the comparison, and I really wanted to put these two next to each other on the top 20 list because I really don't think there is a gigantic difference in how these two have played over the course of this year, and if anything, I do believe that Faker in his time has been a better player. Now, a lot of people are going to point to the idea that, T1 lost Faker for a good couple of weeks, a good month plus of the season, and absolutely imploded. They needed to get him back for playoffs. They did get him back for playoffs, and then they immediately went back to becoming one of the best teams in the world and went on a run to the finals. But even when Faker was, in the lineup, he still was the best player on T1, in my opinion. I think that was pretty clear over the course of the summer split. He was the most active player on the team. He was moving around the map. He was the one that was creating a ton of the plays. I know that the shot calling kind of aspect of his game is the one that's being focused on the most right now because of the situation that just existed with him leaving and the team getting worse, but I think it would be disrespectful towards what Faker has done in 2023 to say that he is just a voice for this team. I think that his mechanical skill is absolutely still there, and in a lot of respects, 2023 was a re-emergence, a re-breakout for Faker, and I don't think a lot of people saw that coming. I think we kind of all thought that Faker was kind of not on the tail end because he was still an elite level player, but he was an honorable mention on this list last year. He was not in my top 20 at Worlds last year, and he kind of lived up to that. He was a really good player, but it was a lot of the other T1 players that kind of, really stepped up and got them to the World Finals. Faker was just kind of the facilitator, and that's kind of the role I think we all expected him to have in 2023. But you look at the spring split, he was second in MVP voting for me, only behind his teammate in Keria. He was phenomenal, easily the best mid laner in the LCK, in my opinion, in the spring split. And then you look at summer, and he was still really good. The only reason he didn't make an all-pro team for me is because he didn't play a lot of games. You just can't really get on an all-pro team in the mid lane in the LCK if you miss that much of the regular season. But Faker is an elite level player, both from a mental perspective and from a mechanical perspective. And I just don't think that, a lot of players in the league really have that same kind of reputation. Now, Faker can be a little bit pigeonholed on what he does on this T1 team because there really are quite a few players on this T1 team that I think require a certain type of playstyle to work, but Faker we know is a very flexible player. You need him to carry games, and you need him to be this big, resource hog. He can do that. It's really not his specialty, but he can do that. Where he's really at his best is facilitating, helping out the rest of his team. It's the reason I compare him to BDD. I think both of them have very similar roles in how they make the rest of their teammates look a lot better, specifically their junglers, and not to say anything bad about either Owner or Cuz, but I think that, that's just the style that this team likes to go for, and I think that's definitely going to be the case, which is why Faker doesn't come in the top 10, although I definitely considered it. He's just a really solid player. I think when you're looking at Faker's 2023, it's probably the best year that he's had in maybe 4 or 5 years, and that's a pretty astounding thing to say, especially considering he missed a ton of time. So really impressive stuff for Faker. He comes in as the #1 player for one of the best teams in the entire world, and the king is going to continue to reign. Can he finally kind of conquer his demons though and get this T1 team over the hump? That remains to be seen. And now moving on to number 12 in these rankings, we're really starting to get into the nitty-gritty now. These are all world-class players. I mean, everybody that we've mentioned in this video is truly a world-class player, but we're really at, like, the top of the top, right? The best players in the world, not even just the best players at Worlds, right? You always want to assume that the best players go to Worlds, but, I mean, really, these top 12 are the 12 best players in the world, and we get to kick that off with number 12 in my rankings, and that is going to be Missing, the support for JD Gaming. Some people might see this as too low. Some people might see this as just right. It's going to be interesting to see where the balance is when it comes out to Missing, because I do like him a lot as a player, but obviously he's helped out a ton by the fact that he's on the best team in the world right now in JDG. Now, that's not to take away from the fact that he's a big reason, or at least a pretty sizable reason why they're the best team in the world. I'm certainly not going to try and deny that. But it's kind of interesting to try to pull apart some of his individual performances when you compare them to other supports that he has to go up against in terms of reputation, which is why he comes in at number 12 here. Still, he's one of the highest rated supports in the world, number 3, and that's pretty darn good, and I really do think that he's proven that over the course of this year. There really is no more doubt. He is just as big a part of JD Gaming's success as anybody else on the team. So let's go ahead and talk about him. He's an interesting player. His career arc has been really fun to watch. He was a really good young player for WE. People seem to forget about that. They were a really interesting team, and then obviously things don't end up working out. He never ends up getting to Worlds, and so he ends up heading to JD Gaming. They have that amazing year last year that I don't think a lot of people were anticipating. He was a really big part of that. One of the better players on that team last year, him, Kanavi, and Yagal were definitely the standouts, and 369 obviously for a lot of people. But that bot lane overperformed by a lot. And so what do? They go out and get Ruler to pair with him this offseason, which is obviously a very huge move, but Missing has adapted to that as well. He's been kind of the quote-unquote carry in this bot lane before, not really the resource carry, but he's been somebody who has been, you know, actively trying to make plays. They put Ruler a bit more on an island and allowed him to be a little bit more of a weak side player in certain games, but they've also been more than willing to invest into him as a bot laner early on in games to try to snowball it out of control. And, you know, we can talk about how that's really good for JD Gaming, but what isn't brought up enough in that discussion is how versatile Missing has to be able to pull off all of those styles at such a high level. He can play at every part of the game in every way possible, which is why when you look at the champion pool that he has used the most over the course of this year, it's a bunch of different types of champions. It's a big playmaker in Rakan. It's an enchanter that can really set up his bot laner in Lulu. It's Rel, who wants to be moving around the map, but is more of a, you know, calculated teamfight engaged champion rather than kind of the pick-oriented style of Rakan. I just think Missing can do it all. Like, really, whatever you need him to do, he's just another incredibly solid player. Pretty similar to the ones we've talked about before. But unlike some of the players that we have talked about in the top, you know, 17 or so, I think Missing's upside is way higher than this. If he came out of this tournament as the best support in the world, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. He could have a couple of really fantastic games, and especially with the support system around him, there is really a potential for a complete breakout from Missing, which is very hard to have happen on a team as talented as JDG, but I could absolutely see a universe in which he just starts to take over some of these games, especially in the mid game, where he's incredibly strong. A smart player that doesn't really make a ton of mistakes and really accentuates the talent around him and makes his superstars even better. Missing more than has earned his spot here in the top 12, and, you know, I think there's definitely potential for him to climb even higher as this tournament goes on. And now moving on to number 11, it kind of compounds here with number 12 for me. 12 was definitely kind of the start of things, and then 11 kind of takes it into that next stage, if you will, because number 11 for me is going to be On, the support for Billy Gaming. We've got back-to-back LPL supports Missing, and then On, purposefully back-to-back again. A couple of back-to-back people, just in general on this list. Some people that kind of connect that I wanted to make sure were kind of grouped together, and Missing and On were definitely two of those players that I wanted to make sure were kind of in the same vicinity in terms of where they were on this list. They end up at 11 and 12, and I think that's about right for both of them. Where Missing is, I think, a lot more of a stable player, still has the highs of, like, one of the best supports, if not the best support in the entire world. I think On's going to give you a few more of those moments than maybe a player like Missing will, and I think he's had to do more for his team this year than Missing has. And again, you're kind of splitting hairs when it comes to these two. If you wanted to put Missing higher, I'm certainly not going to object to that, and that's probably going to be the big conversation surrounding these two in their placements. But let's go ahead and talk about On just isolated as a player. Who is On? What did he do? Well, very, very similar story to his running mate in the bot lane right now in Elk, who was, you know, a player that never really got a major shot on an international stage or on a really good team before. Not a lot of people were really aware of them as a super high-valued prospect, but again, even more so than Elk, and, you know, Elk was definitely a W take from me, you know, like 2 years ago, last year. On has been, like, one of the best takes that I've had on this channel, because ever since he started, basically, for Weibo, or for Suning back in the day, I've been planting my flag in him being one of the best supports in the world. Maybe not at the moment, but I always saw it in him. I always saw the potential, and I know a lot of people were crying at the time that Sword Art wasn't starting over him, but On's been that guy for a long time. He was that guy for Weibo in 2022. People kind of forget about that. That team was in desperate need for anything to happen. Topside was an absolute disaster for that team last year, and bot lane was hugely clutch. Both Huanfeng and On were both really good for that team, but specifically On was a superstar breakout for me, and I talked about that a ton in my LPL videos. Last year, he goes to a BLG team that's really looking to make some waves, and make some waves he did. He at points throughout this year really looked like the best support in the world, and that's pretty crazy to say. Obviously, more so known for his aggressive, you know, engage style, is going to be known more for Rakan and Nautilus and Blitzcrank and those champions that he's going to be willing to bring out and try to play make and create plays on. A lot of what BLG does, specifically in the bot lane, does run through On. He's moving around the map. He's usually the one that gets to play the most forward, and that's why it's really nice to have players like Yagao and June, because they do a really good job of being able to facilitate that style. They don't need a ton of resources. You can play a lot more for the support to really be out on the map and trying to be really aggressive in those situations, and that's really, I think, been a boon for BLG over the course of this year. Now, On is certainly not without his faults as a player. He can be over-aggressive. There are going to be games that he is just a complete negative for his team. The comparison that I always gave Western fans who weren't as familiar with the LPL is he's kind of like a souped-up, a juiced-up Hylissang, if you will, where Hilly is going to have some really good games and some really bad games. On's going to do the same thing, except I think his good games are a little bit better, and I think that's really where you're at with On, is he's one of the few supports in the world right now that I think on any given day, in any given game, can just instantly win you the series. He really is that dominant, and so I think he's more than earned his spot at number 11. If he was more consistent over the course of this year, or if he had a bigger resume to back up how well he had played over the course of this year, he would pretty easily be in the top, like, 8 or top 7 players in the world right now, but it's just a little bit too much of an unknown for me to go ahead and put him in there right now, and he doesn't even come in as my number 1 support. He comes in as my number 2, and the number 1, you know, out of between him and Missing, which I think is pretty solid, but still a lot to prove for me. But if there's anybody that you don't have to convince to get on the On hype train, it's probably me, because I've been, you know, chugging along on it already for about 3 years now. But now we've done it. We've gotten into the top 10. It is top 10 time. I think this is really where a lot of people start to see the big change. You know, top 20 is really cool and all, but if you're a top 10 player at Worlds, you're like super duper elite. And while I do think it's probably a little bit closer to 12 right now because of just how many good players there are, top 10 still is very much an accomplishment, and I wanted to treat it as such. And so all 10 of the players in my top 10 are, you know, best player in the world caliber on any given day. They can all have performances that can exceed anybody else's in the world. And so really, really big stuff. If you make this, it's a pretty big deal. And so we're going to kick off my top 10 with Kiin, the top laner from KT Rolster. Congratulations to Kiin. What a bounce back year. Kind of similar to what we were talking about with BDD, his teammate earlier on in the list. This is a pretty big accomplishment for someone who looked to be, I don't want to say on the downswing of their career, because that's not really how esports works. It's not like you just get significantly better or significantly worse. As long as you're willing to put in the time to practice and keep yourself sharp, then you're probably still going to be very good at the game. But Kiin looked like he wasn't keeping up as well in 2022. It didn't feel like he was the same kind of dominant top laner that he has been over the course of his entire career. He had the worst year of his career, in my opinion, in 2022. Obviously, it was still better than a lot of other people's, but, you know, the Kwangdong Freaks weren't very good. That team really just underperformed, disappointed in a lot of different ways, and I think Kiin was a big part of that. His lane stats were good, but he basically had no impact outside of that. It looked like he gave up on the season about halfway through, and so to see him move on to KT Rolster with a bunch of other players that were really looking at bounce-back seasons, players like BDD, or a player like Aiming, who had a big breakout, but, you know, hadn't really been all that, you know, legendary or sustainable up until that point, you know, for him to be able to come back to that team and, in my opinion, really kind of dominate on them and really kind of re-solidify himself as one of, if not the best top laner in the world, it's even more impressive than the individual performances on the Rift, which of course are spectacular. Kiin, again, you know, you get to this point and I stop really being able to talk about strengths and weaknesses because these players don't really have like defined weaknesses. There isn't one area of the game that they really struggle in. Kiin is very versatile in how he can play, but I think when we think about Kiin, we think about the ability to win lane 1v1 so consistently. That's what he's been able to do over the course of his entire career. His CSD at 15 stats over the course of his career are just the best. Like, there's almost no top laner in the history of League that's been able to do what he's been able to do so consistently. If you leave him isolated, which teams often like to do because he's very good at being able to avoid ganks, very smart player who has great communication with the rest of his team, specifically on this KT team, which we'll talk about in a second, but you know, you have to really isolate him, and he's going to beat you isolated. Like, he's just better than you, and so Kiin's a really big asset to have. He can play a lot of bruisers. He likes to play these early game bruisers, but he can scale into the late game as well. He's a great split pusher, but he's an even better team fighter. When you talk about top laners, typically speaking, they're either carry-oriented, they want to split push, they want to, you know, take towers, generate their own leads, and then potentially group and try to take over fights with the gold that they've been able to accumulate, or they're going to be more passive, weak-side, tank-oriented players. That's typically the camps that you like to associate with top laners. Kiin kind of finds this weird middle between those two where he doesn't really need a lot of resources because he's able to generate so many so consistently on his own, but he's also going to be able to carry team fights in terms of the damage and in terms of the setup that he's going to be able to do. He's just great at every phase of the game. He's basically the perfect top laner in terms of what you would want to create. Now, if there is a weakness to Kiin's game, it's that sometimes he's not as dominant as other top laners we've seen dominate over the course of the history of League of Legends. Sometimes we see a player that can just kind of split push off into a side and just win games on his own. Like, you're thinking of 2018 The Shy, you're thinking of Marin in 2016, you know, players like that that have just been able to, like, actively win games on their own. I'm not quite sure Kiin is that guy, but what Kiin does is make everybody else on the team's job so much easier because he helps everybody out. And so KT definitely is a big positive for having him. And, you know, obviously I talked about it a bit before, but the communication between KT Rolster is top notch. It's some of the best in the entire world. And it's very clear that, you know, Kiin is a big part of that. He's been very vocal over his entire career. And I think that, you know, he's just someone who lends a lot of credence into that top side. There aren't a lot of elite level top laners on a global stage right now. Kiin is definitely one of them, and I think after especially his 2023, there really is no denying that he deserves to be in this top 10. And then moving on to number 9, another kind of pairing that I wanted to put together here with number 10 and number 9. It's not quite the same as the ones before it, though. A lot of the other pairs, quote-unquote, were position mates. You know, Elk and Gala next to each other, On and Missing next to each other. This is not a position mate kind of system. These are two teammates that are back-to-back. So coming in at number 9, and as my number 1 support, it is going to be Lehends, the support for KT Rolster, coming in at number 9. He is the best player on KT. He is the best support in the world at the current moment. And I've completely bought in on Lehends, which is a crazy statement to make because of my opinion on him going into Worlds last year. If you go back and watch that top 20 video, and you go back and watch really any of the content that I put out, especially in the LCK domestically in 2022, I actually kind of downplayed what Lehends was able to do on that Gen G team last year because it really felt like Ruler was just taking over every single game and making Lehends' job so much easier. He could play super aggressive because he never really had to worry about not having tempo and about not having pressure. Ruler was consistently able to generate an early 2v2 lead in any matchup that they wanted to put him in, and so Lehends was able to do his super aggressive things, and I was concerned that if you moved him off of that team, if you moved him off of a team that just consistently was able to generate such consistent early game leads, that he wasn't going to be able to be as proactive and as strong of a player. But if anything, I think his 2023 was even more impressive for me. I'm not sure if that's going to be, you know, believed by everybody, but I think this is the best year of his career by a gigantic margin. A player that not only last year had I written off, but, like, I've never really been a huge fan of Lehends. Even going back to the Griffin days, going back to the Afrika days, I'd never really felt like he was the same kind of superstar takeover support that everybody seemed to make him out to be. This is the year where I got it. Like, this is the year where it clicked for me on film. This is the best support in the world at the current moment. He does everything that you could want him to do. Kind of like what we were talking about with On. He's an incredibly aggressive support that's certainly going to be looking for a lot of engage opportunities, is going to be looking to push the tempo, but the reason he ranks higher than On, and the reason why I don't classify him in the same bracket as players like On or Hillisang for a Western audience is because he doesn't make the mistakes that those players make. He really isn't a player that is very feast or famine. He doesn't flip games really anymore. Most of the time, he's just a positive. When he's on, he's like actively changing the game, he's moving around the map, he's causing chaos and destroying enemy lanes, and when he's off, he's just a good player, he's just not a great player, and for that to be your negative, for that to be your floor, that's ridiculous, and that's why to me, he's the best support in the world at the current moment. He was my runner-up for MVP in the LCK in the summer split, only behind Peyz. He's just everything that you could want in a support, and I've been completely sold on Lehends as a player. We talked about the communication on KT Rolster being such a massive strength for that team over the course of this split, their macro being basically impeccable, specifically in the mid-game when they have generated a lead. And that's because Lehends just does everything in his power to shut enemy teams down. There is no safe spot on the map with Lehends, especially if you're behind. He's going to be super risky and aggressive with his vision control. He's going to try to get into your jungle. He's going to look to try to make plays, even when you won't expect him to. Even when it looks like there really isn't a ton of follow-up, he's going to be able to find a way, and because of just how KT communicates and how they work together, oftentimes they're able to make it work out. And so Lehends, coming in at number 9 on this list, coming in as my number 1 support, and somebody who I think has really solidified himself as one of the best players in the world. And then at number 8, we've got a player that I really debated on putting higher, because overall, if you just look at the sample size in 2023, they probably should be higher than the ranking that they are in this video, but it's just so hard when you get down to the best of the best here to rank any of these players with smaller sample sizes this high. But if anybody can jump up, it's going to be this kid. Coming in at number 8, it is going to be Peyz, the AD carry for Gen G. I feel really conflicted because, man, he performed like a top 5 player in the world so far this year, but it's the first year he's ever played in the top level of any region. It's impossible for me to rank him in the top 5 in terms of all of the players in the world. I understand that I just gave him the MVP in the LCK, which is certainly not an easy feat to attain, but at an international level, you just got to prove it to me first, but I'm all in. I'm all in on the Peyz hype train. I know that there are people out there that are not as in on the Peyz hype train as I am, but I don't know, man. I'm all in. I'm all aboard. I think he is on pace to be the best AD carry in the world by, you know, whenever he wants to be, really, if he isn't already, right? He really is that good. He's got pretty stiff competition. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but Peyz is freaking fantastic. There really isn't a lot that I can give you on him that you don't already know about him. If you don't know about him, if you're unfamiliar, if you only watch Worlds and aren't familiar with, you know, what is going on in the LCK or what happened at MSI, Peyz has taken over for Ruler as the AD carry of Gen G. Ruler obviously going to JD Gaming. We'll talk about that a bit later. And he stepped in and basically been everything Ruler was immediately as a 17-year-old in the LCK. And you couldn't have asked for a better start to a career than what Peyz has been offering. He was my MVP in the LCK this split. I believe they ended up giving it, the broadcast ended up giving it to Lehends. I think both were pretty deserving, but Peyz to me was pretty clear. He was kind of the runaway for me for a lot of the split. I just felt like he was the most dominant. He really does a lot well. He's exceptional as a team fighter. That's really where he just completely outclasses basically everybody else that he goes up against. Is if he's going into the late game at relatively even, he's just going to be better in team fights than you are. Like, I don't know how you can be that at 17. I don't know how you can be so consistent in every game against any opponent, but that's where Peyz is at. I trust him so much in the back half of games. He has run into some issues in the early game. They're not major. They're certainly not things that I'm going to be particularly concerned about against not the best teams in the world. But when you are at Worlds and facing the best teams in the world, the best bot lanes in the world, I could perhaps be a little bit convinced that Peyz might struggle a bit more in the laning phase. But again, for Peyz as a player, most of the time, really all he has to do is survive. Because if you get him into the mid game, he's very active as a skirmisher. And especially with how Gen G likes to play the game, they've sped up in recent weeks, which I think is really what helped them win the LCK, is their ability to kind of change some of their game plan and get Chovy on the map a little bit more and try to make some plays happen in the mid game rather than just relying on their scaling like they had been in the spring split. I think that Peyz, you know, has really adopted that style a little bit better, and I think it definitely helps him because it lets him get online a little bit earlier, which I think in general is just a really good thing for him. But if you're really relying on him to mess up, you're going to be waiting a long time. You're going to need to make proactive moves against a player like Peyz. The champion pool, Aphelios, Zeri, Xayah, it's nothing outstanding. It's basically everything that's been meta, but he's an AD carry. His job is to play what's meta. Like, we can talk about off-meta picks and a lot of other roles. ADC typically is not the role that you want to be super off-meta in. If you're going to dominate on the best picks, then that's really the avenue you want to go in. But again, the Aphelios in particular looked unstoppable. He plays Zeri better than anybody else in the world, or at least he has over the course of this this year, if you look at every single post-match thread for Gen G on Reddit over the course of this year, every single one, you'll see a comment about how Zeri is super broken and overpowered, and then the next game, Fred Breon will play it. Sorry, OK Breon will play it. And, you know, nobody will talk about it because it didn't do anything. Peyz makes that champion ridiculous even after the nerfs, and it's just really, really fun to watch. He's basically everything you could ask for in an AD carry. Again, the big negatives are he's not the most proactive in the early laning phase. He does rely on his teammates to do that, and the sample size. He's 17 years old, and he played his first ever game of professional League of Legends this year, and so yeah, this is his first Worlds, and this is the first time he's ever really been given this spotlight. To be in the top 10 in my top 20 is already pretty ridiculous, but again, if everything goes right for him, and if he really has the tournament that I think he can have, he could be top 5 and hell, even higher, closer to top 1 by the end of this tournament if everything goes right. Moving on to number 7 now, and this player really doesn't need a ton of introduction. It's a player that I've constantly banged the table for over the past, like, I don't know, 5 years or whatever, 3 years, or as long as this channel's been going. I've been super high on him through the ups, through the downs. I've always felt confident in him. Coming in at number 7 for me, it is going to be Peanut, the jungler for Gen G. Just a great player. I mean, really, what can I say about Peanut that a lot of people haven't already said, or that I haven't already said over the course of this channel's history? He comes in at number 7. This is a little bit lower than he was on the list last year. I believe he came in at number 4 on my list last year, so not a ridiculous drop, but, you know, a little bit, and I do think that's fair. I don't think he was quite as sensational over the course of this year as he was in 2022, but that's mostly because I think he was clear-cut the number 1 jungler. Maybe not clear-cut, because Kanavi was awesome last year, but he was the number 1 jungler in the world last year, and I just don't feel as strongly about him this year. I still think he does everything well, and I think that his flaws are still the same exact flaws that we talked about in last year's video and that we've talked about with Peanut over the course of his entire career, but I think for the most part, he still is the most consistent jungler in the world. He really is someone that is going to give you the same game in and game out. He's an in-game leader, he's a technician, he's a meta definer with some of the picks that he's able to bring out. He's just really good at what he does. So let's get into some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses. Peanut's biggest strength, I think, is his proactivity in the early game. We'll talk about that a bit later with another jungler that's going to be coming up, but it's the most important trait that you can have as a jungler in the current meta. Your ability to be able to generate pressure quickly and efficiently without giving up a ton to the other team, because if you're able to establish early pressure, all of a sudden the game becomes a ton easier. Tempo is stronger than it has ever been at the current moment in League of Legends, in my opinion, and I think Peanut really recognized that midway through this year and really started to change up his playstyle. Peanut had always been a little bit of a slower jungler. He was really good in the early game, but he was a fantastic team fighter. That's what he was known for mostly in the beginning parts of his career. You were talking about more of the carry-oriented style that got him onto teams like T1 or SKT back in the day. But now he's definitely much more of a facilitator as a jungler, and I think that that helps his team for the most part. He's really settled into this role as an engaged threat. That's really what he does at a super high level. He's translated a lot of that team fighting prowess that he had as a big carry threat back in the day into just being the most consistent engage and priority creator in the entire world. And that's really what has solidified Gen G as the best team in the LCK over the course of this year, is Peanut's ability to just do everything that his team asks of him. He has been fantastic for this team, and, you know, the Vi, the Wukong, the Maokai, they definitely encapsulate what he's been able to do. He was the one who really kind of introduced Poppy Jungle into the pro meta, and that obviously took over a ton last year, but, you know, when you're talking about weaknesses for Peanut, first, I would be remiss not to mention the fact that there have been times that the lights get brighter and he gets a little bit dimmer, right? Like, that just kind of seems to be something that has plagued Peanut at least a little bit in the past. It was certainly a conversation surrounding him at Worlds last year. However, I do think it is completely blown out of proportion. There are other players that get that label that I understand it a tad bit more. Zeus, I think, gets it a little bit now, although after his playoff performances, maybe he doesn't deserve it nearly as much, but Peanut, I think, is certainly a player that has had a couple of bad performances, but, you know, his good performances are absolutely still there. He was still fantastic at Worlds for the most part last year, and so I'm certainly not going to look down on him too much for that. I think the nerves are definitely something that he has struggled with, but I trust that he's going to be able to deal with it, especially because he's one of the most experienced players at the World Championships now. And then I think other weaknesses can include sometimes playing from behind. I think that is generally a weakness for junglers. I think Peanut is arguably one of the best in the world at that, but it's just really hard to do that in the current jungle matchup, in the current jungle position. Also, he's not really someone that is going to be good if you give him everything, right? This team doesn't really function super well playing around him, and not because I think Peanut's a bad carry player, but because I think players like Chovy and Peyz on this team really do like to have resources. Even Doran, I think, is better with the resources in these instances than someone like Peanut, and so if you do run into a circumstance where Peanut is your primary carry in team fights, Gen G might have a little bit less knowledge on how to play out scenarios like that. They've shown that over a couple of points this year, but I think those are nitpicks, right? That's not Peanut's fault. Like, he can still carry games. He's still good enough to be a damage threat as a carry, but I think he's going to continue to solidify his spot as the best facilitating jungler in the entire world. And again, he really deserves to be in the top, 6 or 7 players in the entire world. I think that he's consistently been there over the past 2+ years, and nothing's really changed about that going into 2023. And then moving on to number 6 now, just barely outside of the top 5. Probably a rough position to be, but I can't imagine it's too rough. Top 6 in the world is still pretty solid, and coming in as my number 1 top laner, potentially as a consolation prize, it is going to be Bin, the top laner for Bilibili Gaming. He is going to come in as number 6 on this list, number 1 in terms of my top lane rankings, and I really don't think this one is disputable all that much anymore. I know some people are going to put 369 over him. I know that I'm just lower on 369 and what he does for JDG, but to me, it's just very, very clear. Bin is the best top laner in the world right now. I think Kiin is the closest to trying to get on his level, but Bin just dominates games in ways that you don't see out of that position all that frequently, especially in the modern game, where top lane is basically weak side every game, right? Like, there really aren't a lot of teams that, in fact, I can't think of any, that consistently play for topside. It doesn't matter with Bin, though, because he's able to generate his own leads. He is a carry player. Let's make that clear. He's not the same kind of player that I was talking about with Kiin, where, he's a little bit better at being isolated. He can play weak side if you need him to play something like Ornn. He's going to be able to pull it out and do it well. Bin certainly can play Ornn, and that's kind of a new development for him. We're very excited to be able to see that, but for the most part, this is a carry-only kind of player, and that's what's really kind of generated his reputation over the course of his career, especially with things like the Gangplank, which, worth noting, is coming back into meta with some of the ult changes, but I think Bin is a really, really good carry. One of the best in the entire world, regardless of position, which is why he lands in this spot. It's just very hard for a top laner, typically, to be as useful as what Bin is, but he's probably the best team-fighting bruiser in the entire world, and I think that, at the very least, gets you top 6. I think when you look at the champion pool, you kind of get an idea. The Jax is number 1, but really the signature champion over the course of this year has been the Gwen. Gwen is in a really interesting spot right now. Obviously, it's kind of become a little bit of a flex pick. We could potentially see that moved into the jungle a little bit more frequently with some of the changes, but Bin is like the best Gwen I've ever seen. It's actually absurd how he's able to handle this champion. He plays her so aggressive in the mid game, and that's really where he's able to generate most of his leads. When you're thinking about Bin, he's not the same kind of player that you would typically associate with generating like this 25-30 CS lead and then just kind of snowballing the game out of control. He's much more of a, I'm going to do fine until I win one fight, and then as soon as I have that gold lead, all of a sudden, I'm going to play as aggressive as possible. I'm going to be in your face the entirety of this game, and there's nothing you can do about it because I'm just going to outplay you, and that's more of what Bin is going to offer you as a player. Really, really like what he's able to do. I think he complements what Bilibili does incredibly well. Like I said, they're a very fast-paced team. This is not a team that likes to wait. This is not a team that likes to, kind of bide their time and wait for their advantages. Jun is a very fast jungler, likes to play for the early game. On is a very fast support, likes to play for the mid game, and Bin is certainly somebody who is more than willing to take over in the mid game as well, but the team fight stage is really another avenue where he's able to completely take over. We talked about that being the advantage for Kiin. I think you could argue that Bin is just as good in the team fight stage, except I think he's exceptionally better in the mid game, and that's really where I think things start to separate. And so, really, really great year from Bin. Basically everything you could ask for. I think RNG definitely regrets trading him to BLG, but, this team definitely did struggle a bit more, and I'd be remiss not to mention the fact that over the past 2 months, Bin has certainly not been the same player that he was, over the course of his, I would say 7 months before that, the rest of the year, but he had probably the best regular season of his entire career. He's had a lot of peaks, and so I don't want to say he had the best year of his career, but this has always been a player that has stepped up more when the games matter most, and that's definitely intriguing. Somebody with World's Finals experience from his time on Suning back in the day, back in 2020, and so he's got the experience needed to carry this BLG team, and I do believe he is the best player on Bilibili Gaming, the number 2 seed from the LPL, and to be the best player to come in at number 6, I feel like that's a pretty fair evaluation here. And finally, we have reached the top 5. The top 5 in this list is obviously incredibly prestigious. This is where you want to be. This is where the elite of the elite talent are. Top 3 is great. Top 1 is fantastic. But top 5, I think, is a lot of people's break point in terms of the best players in the world. And I can understand why. And so, a very important distinction to be able to make it into here. So, who ended up making it? Well, we'll go over it now. Coming in at number 5, just barely cracking it into my top 5, it is going to be Scout, the mid laner for LNG Esports. A fantastic year for Scout. I mean, basically everything that you could have asked for from Scout this year came true. Leaving EDG was actually a little bit of a scary proposition for Scout. Obviously, probably not, personally with everything we know about the team and about his relationship with them, but from a career perspective, the team that he had really come up on and really kind of established himself on, the team that he had won a world championship on. It was a big deal for him to leave and go to LNG, especially replacing a player like Doenby, who, while is a big name, didn't exactly live up to the expectation. Last year wasn't able to get that team to Worlds when they really did expect it. I think a lot of people were looking at LNG as a team that kind of had a similar outlook to what they were in 2022, again in 2023, with Scout essentially just kind of transitioning into being a very good, but maybe not like bring your team over the top kind of mid laner. But man, was that not the case for what happened in 2023. Two-time MVP Scout. That is a ridiculous statement to make, but he won MVP in spring, and then he only went and did it again in the LPL in summer. Absolutely ridiculous. This team wasn't as successful as maybe they wanted to be in the spring split, and so they go out and get GALA, as we talked about earlier, in the summer split to be able to try and do better as a team, as a unit, and it absolutely comes true. While they weren't as dominant at the beginning, it took some time for them to really develop the chemistry and the synergy that they needed to generate. Once they got online, they were unstoppable. They made finals in the LPL in the summer split. Obviously, because of championship points, they still had to qualify through the qualifiers, the season finals. But this team is one of the best teams in the entire world, and a lot of that is because of Scout. He has been arguably the most productive player in the world. You can talk about talent, and, Scout is absolutely up there in terms of talent, but in terms of results and production, if you just want to go off of the tape, if the only thing I could watch was 2023, Scout's the best player in the world right now. Like, he really is playing at that level. I don't think a lot of people really understand that, and I really want to make a clear point to say that. Scout, at the moment, from a performance perspective, is the best player in the world. Now, the reason he's number 5 and not number 1 is because I just don't know if I can project that onto an entire tournament here, where the best of the best are playing consistently. Scout does a really good job of taking advantage of worse players, and that's why he was able to do so well in the regular seasons, but it's not like he's a schmuck against the best players in the world either. He's just a really good, really strong mid laner. Now, Scout, over the course of his career, has been more of a, I don't want to say a selfish mid laner, but definitely a more resource-heavy mid laner. That's kind of been the big MO on Scout. That all changed in the middle of last year. We talked about EDG a lot in 2022, kind of going through their own personal arc, I guess you could say. They had to take Jeja out of the lineup, put Junjia in order for them to really realize that they don't have to play through Scout every game, and I think Scout is one of those players that really kind of enjoyed that, enjoyed the freedom of being able to play a little bit more loose, a little bit more roam-oriented style, and I think he adapted to it well. He's been doing it a lot more on LNG. However, the bread and butter of what Scout likes to do is still going to be running through the mid lane. That's why you can take a look at it. Jace was the biggest pick for Scout over the course of this year. Now, that was the case for a lot of LPL mid laners. Jace was dominant in China. It really was the premier pick basically in any role in that region, but Scout in particular was one of the players who really optimized what Jace was able to do, being able to generate tempo super early on in the mid lane, and using that tempo not only to bully the enemy laner into giving up basically every resource that they need to, but also taking the game away from the enemy jungler. It was why he was so successful in being able to snowball games out of control, and it's why he got so many Player of the Game awards. It's because he does such a good job at being able to take a small lead and turn it into a big lead because of the way that he plays. Now, is that going to be able to translate every single game against the best teams in the world? It's certainly possible, and Scout certainly has the potential to be able to do that. He can go up lane, 1v1 against anybody else in the world, and I'm going to feel pretty good about him, but it's certainly something to bring up that it is a style that is a little bit more risky, especially when you're playing better teams. So if you're looking for a reason why Scout might not be that performer at Worlds, that would be it. But if he can just get most of what he was able to do over the course of the LPL season, both in spring and in summer, Scout's going to exceed this number 5 ranking. And for a player who wasn't even ranked, even being at the tournament last year in my top 20, wasn't even an honorable mention, for him to jump all the way up and have a career year after being a former world champion in 2023, get to that top 5 spot, it's probably one of the most impressive years that we've had in recent memory, and you've just got to be excited for a player that has really solidified his legacy in Scout. And then moving on to number 4 in these rankings, this is what I would like to call the top of the A tier. We're going to get into the A+, S tier players in the top 3, because I really do believe that top 3 is just kind of different than everybody else at the current moment in terms of skill, in terms of production, in terms of everything, but that should not discount the player coming in here at number 4, who is going to be Kanavi, the jungler for JD Gaming. It was incredibly difficult for me not to want to put Kanavi higher. I think most years, Kanavi would be somebody that would be a pretty easy choice for top 3, but the top 3 players in the world are just all so ridiculous right now that Kanavi unfortunately ends up at number 4, but in my opinion, he's the best jungler in the world. I think most people are going to agree with that at the current moment, and I really do believe Kanavi, maybe more so than some of the other players we talked about, isn't necessarily this jack of all trades, master of all kind of player where it's like, you know, he's good at everything and doesn't really have any defined weaknesses, but isn't like this super hyper carry that dominates every single game. Kanavi is the super hyper carry that dominates every single game, and he does have a specific playstyle that he likes to go towards. However, that playstyle is so universally good that he's able to really apply it in basically any circumstance with basically any team comp against basically any team, no matter how good they are. As long as he is able to perform, as long as he is able to do the things that he knows he can do at a high level, then he's going to be able to do that, and that's why he's been the best jungler in the world so far in 2023. What is that style? Early game. Then there's really no other way I can put it, is playing super fast. Kanavi for years and years and years has been lauded and praised, and rightfully so, as the best pather in the world. And I don't even think it's remarkably close. Somehow, some way, his jungle clear is just faster than everybody else's. He's able to get out on the map. He's consistently up in CS, and really more importantly, he's consistently up in tempo against everybody else that he plays against. It does not matter who it is. It could be the best, it could be the worst. He's always going to be up in tempo against you. That's what Kanavi does at a ridiculously high level. Now, that is the biggest trait and the best trait for a jungler to have in the current meta, which is why I'm not particularly concerned with the fact that Kanavi doesn't necessarily play well from behind. You know, I would say junglers in general are very susceptible towards the snowball effect of the game at the current moment, where snowballing is pretty out of control, and especially in the jungle, if you're able to generate a lead, you're just really not going to lose it unless you just like completely throw it away. Enemy junglers don't have a lot of opportunities to be able to catch up in the game at the current moment. But specifically for Kanavi, he really does struggle playing from behind, which is why he's just decided to never lose the early game ever again. Like, I don't remember a game this year where he was behind in tempo and stayed that way for longer than, like, the 6th minute in the game. Like, it's actually ridiculous how consistent Kanavi is and how good he is. Now, I don't want to take away from his teamfight prowess as well. He's still really good in teamfights, is a good engager, but that's not really his forte. Like, I don't want to make him sound like a one-dimensional player, but he's able to get such a gigantic lead that by the time we hit the mid-game, the game is usually over for JDG. Now, you can apply a lot of that to a lot of the rest of the players winning as well, which we will as we go further along on this list, but I think Kanavi was arguably the best player on JD Gaming in the regular season across the LPL in 2023. In fact, that was the argument that I did make in my LPL analysis video. That doesn't mean I necessarily think he's the best player on the team, but I do think he was the most impactful towards what this team wanted to do in 2023. And this is the best team in the world. For you to be the most impactful player on the best team in the world, that's a pretty damn good accomplishment. So Kanavi coming in at number 4. Are there teams that are going to be able to take advantage of him? Maybe. I could see some teams that are really fast, really aggressive, being able to at least push him, but the other team that I would consider really fast and really aggressive in terms of playstyle is Billy's, and Billy's had no success against JD Gaming over the course of this year. They've been their kryptonite, in fact, and so, you know, for Kanavi, it feels genuinely like he is kind of unstoppable in the jungle at the current moment. Maybe someone like Peanut would be able to step up and actually contest him. You know, there are a lot of really good junglers that I think at least have the opportunity to make themselves interesting in a situation like this, but if I had to guess, Kanavi's going to be walking out of this tournament as the best jungler and kind of solidifying himself in that role like he has been in the last couple of years. And now we get into the top 3. Like I said before, these are really the cream of the crop. We're done with A tier. We are in A+, S+, whatever your top tier ranking is, that's where we're at. These are the 3 best players in the world. I don't think there are a ton of people out there that are going to dispute that. I think these 3 really just are kind of a cut above everybody else in terms of what they've been able to produce, not only this year, but over the course of their entire career. That's the reason that they're here. Yes, can have players like Scout and Peyz had, you know, seasons that are similar to what these people have output. Yes, but do I truly believe that, you know, these Scout and Peyz are as talented right now as these 3? I can't say that. These 3 just feel like they are the GOATs at the current moment, and so, truthfully, I want to get this out of the way at the beginning of this. These 3 can go in any order. I know people are probably going to skip over a lot of parts to try to get to the certain sections of the video that they want to see, but I truly do believe that you could put my number 1 at number 3, you could put my number 3 at number 1. I'm certainly not going to argue with it even a little bit. I'm going to be like, yes, that makes a ton of sense. There is no argument. These are the S+ tier players. This is 1A, 1B, and 1C, not 1, 2, and 3. But I do have to order them, and so I did. Coming in at number 3, though, for me, it is, maybe surprisingly, going to be Chovy, the mid laner for Gen G. This is certainly not the spot I think people expected to see him in. I've been seeing a lot of people ranking him number 2 in a lot of these lists, and I think that's a pretty consensus ranking for him at the current moment. I think Chovy's awesome. He's had one of his most expansive splits of his entire career so far in 2023. I know Chovy obviously gets a pretty bad rap for being more of a, I don't want to say a selfish player, but certainly a more individualistic, focused player. He has kind of gotten this reputation of being a CS monger, just going around the map, picking up minions, and not really contributing a ton to the rest of the, attack and engage coming from the rest of the team. However, first of all, that wasn't true before. That was never really the case with Chovy. I think that's a pretty inaccurate assumption and a pretty inaccurate assessment of what Chovy was as a player. But even if it was true, he worked so hard on getting rid of that reputation over the course of this year. He was so proactive. He was consistently shoving and roaming out lane. He played more Ahri than basically any other top mid laner in the LCK. Just fantastic stuff. Basically everything you could have wanted to see in terms of growth and development mentality-wise from Chovy was there, because there really is no growth left to be had mechanically. He's the best mechanical player in the world. I know there are 2 players listed above him in this ranking. He's the best mechanical player in the world, and he has been for quite a long time. I don't think really anybody out there is arguing that all that heavily. Chovy is that fantastic. It's always really been just about the decision-making and knowing when to make when to play aggressive, when to play for himself, when to play for his team. And I think he's gotten significantly better at that over the course of this year, which is why he's definitively in the top 3, even though he was already definitively in the top 3. Let's be honest. He's been really good for a really long time. Now, the one thing I do want to point out about Chovy, I bring this up every single time I talk about, his playstyle and the negative connotations that come with it, but I do want to make a point of it in this video, since I assume that, there are going to be quite a few people that watch this that don't necessarily consume all of my content. The reason Chovy struggles sometimes with, I think, overcommitting and trying to gain too many resources for himself, getting a little bit of an overabundance of resources, is because I do feel like he feels a lot of pressure to carry games for his team, especially when his team is behind. You're really not seeing a lot of instances where Chovy makes those mistakes when his team is ahead and when he's winning and when they can close out games and make good macro decisions. You're really only seeing those decisions when the team is losing and Chovy feels like he has to make a last-ditch effort, or he's the only one ahead and he feels like he has to get to the point where he can 1v9. That is a little bit of a negative trait for him, but the positive in that sentence and where this is all going is he doesn't have to do that at all on Gen G. This team is more than talented enough to not only be able to generate consistent leads, but for Chovy to be able to trust that there are other players on the team that can be able to get them out of messes. He doesn't have to do it. 1v9, which I think really was a mentality problem for him. I think he played too much solo queue growing up and just felt like he had to 1v9 every game. You don't have to do that in pro, and I think he's finally starting to learn that. And, so far, he's really fixed a lot of those crazy issues that I think he's run into. So, Chovy definitely deserving of a spot in the top 3. Like I said earlier, he's 1A, 1B, 1C. You could put him at number 1. Is Chovy the best mechanical player in the world? Yes. Does that make him the best player in the world? Maybe. Certainly performs like it at times, but for me, he's going to come in at number 3, and it's still I would say it's still definitely an endorsement of what he's going to be offering. And we've done it. We've narrowed our way down to the top 2. I'm pretty sure you guys can guess who is going to be in my top 2, who my top 2 players are. Especially if you follow the channel, you already know who these 2 players are. I talk about them basically endlessly, and I have for years. These have been the 2 players that I think I've gone on record the most for over the past couple of years. Not that there's any sort of hot takes involved, but I do think obviously me calling them the best players in the world over the past 2 years has certainly paid off relatively well. But what order are they going to be in? Well, coming in at number 2 for me, it is going to be, surprisingly, Ruler, the AD carry for JD Gaming, the consensus number 1 player at this tournament, it seems like, in everybody else's rankings. I get it. I really, really get it. In fact, I almost switched this up basically as this video was going out. I felt really, really good about it for a while, and I didn't, I got to today, and I'm like, do I really put Ruler anywhere other than number 1? I ended up sticking to my guns, so we'll see how that ends up panning out. Let me know down in the comments, but Ruler's really freaking good. Like, he is everything you could ever want out of an AD carry, and then some. I actually caught some flack last year. People might not remember this, but I caught quite a bit of flack last year when I called Ruler the best AD carry of all time. I think people were really excited to kind of jump on the Deft bandwagon after the world title win, and I get it. Yeah, Deft's really great, and he's certainly in the conversation. I think a lot of people still hold Uzi in very high regard, and I still like Uzi as a player, and obviously, he's done a lot over the course of his career, but to me, it's just not really a question. Ruler is the best AD carry to ever play League of Legends, at least professionally, and I think that he's only continued to prove that this year on JD Gaming. He has been a big reason why JDG has turned from a very good team into a super team. Yes, they also got another player, which we will talk about in just a second, that helped like really turn it into like a mega super team, maybe the best and probably the best we've ever seen up until this point. But Ruler is, you know, just as big a reason as anybody else on this roster as to why JD Gaming is as dominant as they have been and why they have an opportunity to complete the Golden Road over the course of, you know, this tournament. And so for Ruler, what does he do well? Everything. He's probably the best early game laner in the entire world. At least at his position. It's very close. I think him and Jackie Love both do a very good job of being able to exert pressure early, but I think Ruler is just significantly more consistent. He makes absolutely zero mistakes. He's very willing to punish overextensions, and there's really not a lot you can do into him. Even if you pick a positive matchup, likely he's just going to come out of it plus 10 in CS, and then he's going to make some crazy play in the mid game that ends up getting him even farther ahead. He's the best early game AD carry, and I just don't even think it's really all that close. And then mid-game is really where he becomes like the greatest AD carry of all time, right? Like, you can talk about early game AD carries. We've seen some really good ADCs that have been able to super consistently generate leads, but not a lot of players ever in any role have been able to take over games the way that Ruler does in the mid-game. I don't know if there's anyone that's better at mid-game skirmishes than Ruler in the world, and that's really clear. Like, the more you watch him, you take a fight at 13, 14, 15 minutes into the game, it's a 3v3 around Dragon, he's going to position perfectly, he's going to pick up a triple kill like 95% of the time, and the game at that point is going to be over. He's going to go mid lane while everybody else is going into side lanes just to pick up farm, but when he notices the jungler trying to gank him for an overextension, he can position out of the way, land a root onto them, and then all of a sudden, he's turned a gank into a kill. Like, these types of plays that other players just don't make, Ruler makes so regularly that it's astounding to me, right? That he sees these things that nobody else will, right? Now, obviously, he has to have a weakness, and while I still believe team fighting to be a strength of his game, I don't think it's quite on the same level as some of the best AD carries in the entire world. I think a player like Peyz is actually a really good comparison. I think Peyz is a better, you know, front-to-back 5v5 team fighter, or at least that's the tape that we've seen this year, but Ruler also hasn't been asked to do that a whole ton. JDG doesn't really get to a lot of neutral situations after 20 minutes into the game, and so I still trust that Ruler's going to be incredibly good at that stage. He has been throughout his entire career, but when you're looking at his strengths, especially over the course of his entire career, you know, the Gen G days as well, the Samsung days, it's early and it's specifically mid-game where he just is unparalleled in terms of the action that he's able to create and the opportunities that he's able to generate as an AD carry, as the role that, you know, probably creates the least amount of opportunities on the map, at least in pro. So Ruler definitely deserving of this number 2 spot, probably deserving of number 1, but number 1's a pretty coveted throne, and unfortunately, he's just not going to be able to get it this year. And that brings us to number 1. If you follow the channel, if you follow League of Legends, you probably know who number 1 is at this point, and it's probably not going to be the most popular take of all time. I do think that I've consistently been higher on this player, and I just don't understand why. It seems public perception is just not catching up to what I have seen over the course of the last 4 years of my life. This is the best League of Legends player in the world as far as I'm concerned. Coming in at number 1 on my list, it is going to be Knight, the mid laner for JD Gaming. I had him at number 1 last year, and people were really upset last year, and I think he's even better this year. I really have nothing else to say. He's the only other player besides GALA, who was miraculously still at 15, who stayed at their same number going into 2023. And he deserves it. I don't really know what to tell you, man. He has dominated every single step of the process. He hasn't been nearly as explosive in the regular season, but I think that's mostly because the team has kind of tried a couple of different styles, JD Gaming in particular. I talked about Kanavi really stepping up and kind of being a focal point for what JDG wanted to do in the regular season. And so Knight hasn't necessarily been the one that everybody's eyes are on, but quite literally, that is the only criticism I can give Knight. That's it. That's all the negatives that I can give him. There is nothing else for me to tell you. Every single time he's been given an opportunity to take over, to dominate a game, to take a team that sometimes is losing and sometimes does need pressure, and just completely flipping the script, or being the one to establish a lot of the tempo and being the one to capitalize on a lot of the pressure that is created from the other pieces. Knight's your guy. Knight is the guy to do that. He is right up there with Chovy and Ruler, in my opinion, as one of the best mechanical players in the entire world. And I think there are very few players that are just as clinical as what Knight is. He doesn't really make any sort of major errors, specifically any mechanical errors really at all in terms of his gameplay, and his mental is fantastic. I know some people kind of lobbied some similar criticisms to what Chovy, you know, has at Knight, but quite frankly, those people just don't watch the LPL. Like, I don't mean to be super critical of his detractors, because everybody is allowed to have a different opinion. I'm not trying to sit here and say that if you don't have Knight #1, then you're crazy, but what I am trying to say is if you think Knight is a selfish player that doesn't play for the team, then I don't know what games you're watching. I genuinely just don't know what to tell you. That just feels like an incorrect assessment of the player as a whole, and so Knight comes in at #1. I think really when you're looking at the strengths, it's just kind of a bit of everything. I think he is probably the best laner in the mid lane in the world. You know, Chovy obviously is really fantastic at it, but Chovy kind of does it in a very different way where he's able to establish a lot of gold, and he's able to establish a lot of tempo through that, and that's obviously very good, but what Knight does is very consistently put pressure on the enemy, and I don't think there is a better player in the world to make a mid laner lose gold than Knight, because he's just so aggressive and so tempo-oriented in the mid lane. He likes moving around with his jungler, with Kanavi. Specifically, that was something he did a lot in the regular season, but he's not afraid to just be like, hey, come perma-gank this guy and just, like, get them super far behind. There are a lot of opportunities for Knight to be able to do that and then translate that pressure elsewhere. He does it incredibly well. His playstyle is very versatile. Ahri, Jace, Annie, these are kind of the LPL picks over the course of this year. Nothing really too surprising about that, but you need him to pull out an Azir. He can do that. He can play Orianna at a very high level. He can play Yone at a very high level. He can pull out the Akali and be an assassin. He can do basically whatever you need him to do. I don't really know what the knock is on Knight. Is it just the fact that he hasn't won Worlds? Like, is that it? Because he just won MSI, and he was Finals MVP at MSI. He's won 2 LPL trophies just this year, and it's not even his first LPL trophy. He was Finals MVP in both of those series, mind you. I don't know what else he has to do. I genuinely don't know what else, you know, Knight needs to really go and show up on. He's been a top 4 performer at Worlds before, back in 2020. And I think he's primed to get even higher. I'm not going to try and spoil my primer video that's going to come out either tomorrow or the day after, but I mean, come on, like, JDG are the favorites to win this tournament. I'm not blowing your mind by telling you that. And if Knight's going to be able to complete the Golden Road, if he's going to be able to win everything, and especially if he gets 4 Finals MVPs out of his 4 championships, I don't know what else to tell you, man. He's one of the greatest of all time at that point, and he's already well on his way to doing that just by his performances alone. I love Knight. I've been a huge Knight fan, and I think this is finally the year that people start to realize that it's not just a great player, he's the best player in the world. All right, but that is going to do it for my top 20 players at Worlds 2023 video. I do hope you guys enjoyed it. It was more like the top 27, like I said, with some of the honorable mentions. I did feel like I had a few controversial takes here, but honestly, I haven't seen a ton of other lists going into this one, so I have no idea whether or not this is going to be controversial or whether or not people are going to agree with it. Would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions on it down in the comment section below. Like I said before, I am going to be posting that Worlds primer video, the big one, the big Worlds primer video that's going to go over all of the teams at Worlds, not only the teams in the main stage, the Swiss stage, but also the play-in stage as well, in depth, talking about my power rankings, ranking every single team, every single player, giving playstyle introductions, just kind of giving you an overview of what you can expect at the World Championships. No one is diving deeper than what I am in the pre-coverage for Worlds here, and if you enjoy that kind of content, hit subscribe. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys enjoy the content, and of course, when those videos do go live, you're going to be the first to see them, and I promise you're not going to want to miss them. We're putting a ton of time and effort into the Worlds content, as I'm sure you're seeing in videos like this. Also, I don't shout this out very often, but go follow me on Twitter. I tweet a lot, especially while games are on and while Worlds is on. I can't promise that I'll be live tweeting all the time. I live in America, and so times aren't exactly ideal for me when the games are playing, but I will be tweeting about the games when I do watch them, so if you want some more reactionary takes, a little bit of a looser me over on that side of the internet, then you can go ahead and check me out on Twitter down in the link below. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.